Hello, my name is Lynn Kronberger, and I am the Chief Development Officer at WAMU. I'd like to thank you all for attending this event this afternoon and welcome you to the Author Series. Here at WAMU, we have deep roots as a media organization in service of the community. We are truth seekers and storytellers. We strive to expand our listeners' horizon, stir their souls, and help them engage in real and meaningful ways with their local, regional, and global community. And we believe these author series do just that. This event is made possible by your donations. Thank you very much. If you'd like to make an additional donation, you can go to dianerehm.org/give. It's the donations made by you that help us produce these events. So now please welcome our host, Diane Rehm.
Thank you, Lynn. And to those of you with me for our earlier discussion of the promise, welcome back. To those joining us now, I'm so glad you're here for this special conversation with Damon Galgut. He's the author of 9 novels, including The Good Doctor and In a Strange Room, both shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And of course, The Promise won the 2021 Booker Prize. Galgut has been described as a vital, nuanced chronicler of the deep hurts of South Africa, both past and present. And perhaps no work showcases that quite as well as The Promise, his tale of the Swarts, a white family living on a farm during the end of apartheid. It's darkly humorous, politically incisive, with writing both beautiful and completely original. If you have questions for Damon Galgut, type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Damon Galgut, welcome to the Diane Rehm Book Club.
Thank you, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I'm most appreciative.
Well, first of all, I'd like to offer my congratulations to you for winning the Booker Prize 2021. It was your 3rd try, and 3rd turned out to be a charm. You must tell us how you reacted when you learned you had won the prize.
Well, with a certain amount of shock, I guess. I guess to the extent that one can get used to these things, I'd got used to being in the top 6 and not being in the number 1 slot, and I fully expected that to be the case this time round as well. So it was one of those moments where you feel slightly disconnected from your body, but we soon reunited.
Where were you when you heard the news? Were you at home?
No, in fact, a small window of opportunity opened amongst all the COVID restrictions, and I was in London. There was a pared down ceremony, much leaner than the usual Booker extravaganza, but just as nerve-wracking, I guess.
I'm sure. Well, it's a wonderful book, and I'm so glad you won the prize. Well deserved. I want to ask you first about your background. You were born in Pretoria around the same age as the Swarts children. Is that about right?
Well, more or less around the age of the eldest son, Anton. He's more or less my contemporary, I think a little bit younger than I am. But the others, they're sort of slightly staggered in age. But yeah, they're living through a time which covers my own mature years in life. So it's a period I know quite well, and I know how these particular characters would have felt moving through it.
And what was life like for you and your family?
At that time, growing up,
Yes.
we were a middle class white family, not exceptional. I don't think my father's of a legal background. He ended his career as a judge, although at that time he was still an advocate. Your average suburban existence, I guess, although there was nothing very average about, white suburban existence under apartheid. My memories of Pretoria are of an exceptionally conservative, stifling, pious and hypocritical place with an underlying current of violence, it should be said, which, permeated much of South Africa at that time, still does in a different way.
Did that violence affect you and your family?
In indirect ways. I mean, the violence of the state was primarily directed at, its Black citizens, for the obvious reason that they were protesting the unjust system that had been imposed upon them. But, South Africa has very, very high rates of violence, all kinds of violence. And nobody really escapes that. At the moment, that violence takes the form of, a lot of robberies, home invasions, and so on. But back in those days, it sort of squeezed into new shapes, I guess. I grew up after my parents divorced under the hand of an Afrikaans stepfather who was of a very violent disposition. But I don't see his violence as fundamentally different to the sort of violence that the state was dealing out. There is a level on which, the psyches of individual people are profoundly connected to the overall psyche of the state, which is to say, the time and place you're growing up in. I think South Africa is a profoundly traumatized society, and we act out that trauma often in the form of violent behavior, which of course gives rise to more trauma. So
indeed. Now, your father was Jewish, I gather.
That's correct.
And he was married to a woman who converted to Judaism?
Yeah, my mom felt when she got married to my father that it would be healthier for all of us if we were raised in the same religious tradition. And to that end, she converted in the Orthodox synagogue, quite an arduous process, I gather. And I was converted at the age of 2. My sister was also converted. But then, my mother never really followed through on the conversion. So we weren't actually raised in the tradition that we converted to. So I don't speak Hebrew. I've never had a bar mitzvah, but in some, back recess of my brain, I still think of myself as Jewish. And technically I am. I have the diploma to prove it. I just, can't talk the talk.
I mean, it's the precise opposite of the Swarts family in that Rachel, the mother, gave up her Jewishness when she married her husband. And then, as the opening chapter reveals, she has reverted to Judaism, wants to be buried in a Jewish cemetery, which displeases a good part of the family. Were you sort of talking about your own family in reverse?
No, I was drawing on my family, put it that way. We had a fairly tumultuous upbringing well, in lots of ways, but specifically, I guess, in the religious way, we moved from that Jewish conversion to a much more Calvinist upbringing under my stepfather. And when that
Dutch
marriage,
Reform.
yes, yes, that was more or less his background, which was indeed the religious underpinning of apartheid was very much of a Dutch Reformed ilk, very, very strict, severe, and as I said earlier, pious. But my mother, when that marriage crashed and burned, sort of yielded to her own impulses, which are very much in an easterly direction. I mean, she subscribes to a particular Indian religion, and that sort of gave me some scope to play in the last section of the book with the sort of new age beliefs that dominate there. But I was also trying to make a larger point, I guess, about South Africa, because we are, in fact, you know, a melting pot, like a lot of colonial societies, made up of, you know, immigrants and incomers from all over. In addition, of course, to the majority of people who were already resident here. And those, you know, influences continue to be felt. So I wanted to show how, you know, very, very varied, colorful, and chaotic white South African society is. It's not a monolithic entity. Yeah. In addition, also, I didn't want to bore my readers, as there are 4 funerals in the book. It's simply more entertaining to have each one fall under a different, you know, religious denomination than to repeat the same one over and over.
But it works so well, those 4 funerals, in presenting not only the family, but the movement of society during those 10-year intervals. I wanted to read to our viewers your opening, a quote from Federico Fellini. "This morning I met a woman with a golden nose. She was riding in a Cadillac with a monkey in her arms. Her driver stopped and she asked me, 'How are you, Fellini?' With his metallic voice, she continued, 'Why is it that in your movies there is not even one normal person?' And that is how you introduce us to the Swarts. Is no one in your mind in that family normal?
Well, I mean, what that Fellini quote raises for me is the question of whether anybody is. You know, there's this woman with a nose made of gold holding a monkey, and she clearly thinks of herself as absolutely normal. Fellini, of course, can see just how wonderfully unique she is, and he puts people like her in his films. I guess. I mean, I love the quote. I found it very funny, and I found it very truthful about humans generally. But, you know, more specifically, in the case of this particular book, I was aware that in some respects, for readers overseas, it might seem like a carnival freak show of very odd, strange people. So I guess on one hand, I was trying to convey that this is in fact South African normality. On the other hand, maybe I was trying to signal to South Africans that what they think of as normal is a bit of a freak show.
The Swarts are quite a family with very differing views on apartheid. What about your own family? What were their views?
I guess my family was of a typically white liberal bent from that period, which is to say they weren't, hardcore dyed in the wool racists. They certainly don't never did think of themselves as racist. But, in the best South African tradition, by which I mean the worst South African tradition, white liberals are very slippery creatures. And, I fit in that category myself. I'm not trying to claim that I'm any different, but, full of hypocrisies and inconsistencies. I've heard a few Black South Africans express the view that they would far rather deal, with a right-wing racist than with an English white liberal. With a racist, you know exactly where you stand. With a liberal, you never do. So I guess my family fits into that bracket. They were not guilty of any atrocious, appalling crimes, but, all of us grew up with extremely warped values, and, it can take a lifetime to free yourself from those perceptions, or misperceptions rather, that you are taught in childhood.
Do you recall when you began to really understand what apartheid was?
Well, one of my saving graces, I guess, growing up was my love of reading. If you read, the world opens up. You are not just dependent on what you're learning from the people around you in an immediate sense. So I guess my thinking had broadened already. I mean, I remember various family arguments where I was expressing views that didn't go down very well and being silenced at the dinner table. I remember an especially intense argument with my grandfather, who simply didn't believe me when I was telling him things I'd seen at a student protest at university. He was just telling me I was wrong, I was a liar, I was mistaken, whatever his belief was. But, there was no road to Damascus moment where I suddenly saw, the extremity of the folly I'd been part of. It was more a slow waking up to the fact that, my instinctive reaction to the society I'd grown up in, which was one of feeling suffocated and ill at ease most of the time, that instinctive reaction was in fact a kind of compass pointing in the right direction. That was an appropriate response. Whereas, all the signals I was receiving were telling me that I was wrong, and my thinking was the inverted, upside down version of the world. So I really don't want to claim that, I had a moral vision that everyone around me lacked. It was more a slow learning, which is an ongoing process, I may add. There are a lot of inbuilt prejudices which we all have to work to shed over our lives, I think.
But I wonder how your father's being Jewish and a judge might have affected you.
He wasn't a judge back in my childhood. My grandfather was. Yeah, I mean, I've always thought it would be an interesting subject for a novel, actually, a judge whose sort of tenure on the bench spanned that period in South African history where we moved from apartheid to our new government, because judges are just there to implement the law. So it would be quite interesting to see the moral shifts in a person that might occur when you go from implementing one set of laws to implementing a totally different one. But the truth is, I was not raised with my father primarily because that they divorced when I was quite young. But secondly, my father's not an especially observant Jew. If he had been, I think I might have been raised in a more humanist Jewish tradition. Jewish South Africans, as Jews elsewhere, were kind of known for being more consciously engaged with the politics around them, and for taking a more forward-thinking approach. I think a lot of Jewish people were in active opposition to the apartheid government, not by accident.
Yes, in active opposition, and indeed worked right along with those Black South Africans who were trying to free themselves from the apartheid rule. To what extent did their influence carry weight? Was it a great deal? Was it none at all? Or was it somewhat?
Of these particular figures
Yes.
yeah. Well, it carried weight in the sense that for white South society at that time, the notion of, publicly taking a stand against the government carried a certain charge of shame, especially with your average sort of middle-class family. I'm very much my own. Anything that drew attention to you as, being a troublemaker or, a loud mouth speaking against the platforms of power was slightly embarrassing and shameful. So those figures were seen as highly controversial. They were clearly perceived as heroic in certain quarters, but not the quarters I was growing up in. They were seen as slight embarrassments, anomalies, not quite explicable.
How do you describe the Swarts family? Where do they fit into the larger South African society?
Well, I wanted them on some level to represent what might be thought of as your average white South African family. In fact, I think there are a couple of paragraphs that gesture in that direction. But of course, there is no such thing as an absolutely typical family. Each family, as Tolstoy tells us, is, each unhappy family is unhappy in a certain way, but most families are indeed unhappy. But I don't think of them as an especially outstanding or unusual family, put it that way. They're not politically engaged or aware, really. So, they're not inclined to be in opposition to the government vocally or actively. But they're not, hardcore racists either. They're probably more or less running in the same channel as the family I grew up in, effectively. Your average family interested in getting by in the world and not much interested in, solving its problems.
Of course, you had the youngest child, Amor, who is struck by lightning at the age of 6, loses a toe, and is regarded thereafter as somewhat strange, if I may use that word, almost magical in her thinking. And she is the one who hears the promise made by the father as his wife Rachel is dying. She asks him to promise to leave the home in which Salome, the loyal housekeeper, homemaker who does so much for the Swarts family, she asks her husband to give her the house, which I gather would have been illegal at that time, but later on does become legal. But Amor is the only one who hears that promise being made. In the discussion we had before you and I began to speak with 3 people, one of whom was a judge for the Booker Prize, he wondered whether the promise was real or fantastical.
Yeah,
I thought that was such an intriguing question.
I'm very pleased he picked up on that. not just on that point, but on others in this book and in others I've written. I like to push back against the sorts of certainties that plots and novels often present, because it seemed to me that certainty is a very unusual quantity in the world. Most of the time, one is never really sure of anything, even your own convictions half the time. So I wanted to leave it as an open possibility that perhaps she didn't hear that promise. Perhaps it's something that she thinks she heard or wishes she heard. And I think that possibility does occur to her, to the character. There's a passage, and I'm probably going to misquote myself, ironically enough, if I try to repeat it.
That's okay.
Yeah, well, I'm allowed to, I guess. But to the effect that when she's challenged about, are you lying? She feels sure that she's not lying, but then she questions herself, but am I telling the truth? So, not lying and not telling the truth, not quite the same thing. So, the truth for Amor is that she believes that promise has been made. And, she believes it so doggedly that she persists in insisting that it be seen through, against the resistance of her family. But it is possible that she misheard it, fabricated it, wanted it to be true. Everybody else, including the father who made it, seems unsure that it's real. So I like the unresolved nature of elements in a plot like that, simply because it resembles the world I know.
Is Amor autistic, or is she simply affected by that lightning strike? It's hard to tell because she does seem to have relations with other women later in life, and indeed with another man. So the question becomes, is she, in her own thinking, is she normal?
Yeah, well, it's kind of an extension on the point we've just discussed, in the same way that you being the reader are not ever entirely sure whether Amor did hear that promise or not. We can never really be sure as readers whether Amor is, a moral visionary or, slightly defective. We hear from various other people, primarily in her family, when she's young, that, oh, there's something wrong with the child, that lightning strike affected her, she has brain damage. And then that perception shifts as she grows older. What seemed strange and odd when she was a child begins to seem like a kind of wisdom because she listens so attentively, but it's never quite resolved. And, in the case of Amor, I needed the book to have some sort of moral center. And, Amor represents that. But I mistrust stories that provide a moral center that's absolutely hard-edged, unwavering, unmistakable. Again, because it doesn't resemble the real world, not the world that I know. I'm going off at a slight tangent, but it's not irrelevant. The world that's presented by a novel is a kind of model of the real world. And I'm bothered by the fact that the literary models that are presented to us are often idealized versions of the world or reassuring versions of it, in which, bad people are punished, good people are rewarded. I mean, the very fact that you can divide characters into good and bad seems like an unrealistic notion to me. Do you know anybody who's utterly evil, whose joy is predicated on causing harm to other people? That's a literary creation. In real life, most of us are a mixture of good and bad, in the sense that we act on self-interest at particular moments and altruistic impulses at others. So I don't think the rest of the family are bad, scheming, evil. They're simply acting out of self-interest and protecting what they see as their own, unfortunately. But Amor, for whatever reason, moves in the other direction. She's somebody who's prepared to give up not only this piece of land, but her entire inheritance.
Indeed.
It's an odd moral impulse, and I didn't want to make it seem too saintly. So I like the fact that there's a certain opacity to her character, something you can't quite read. Is she a saint or is she autistic, as you put it? And of course, the lightning strike might explain it either way.
It's so interesting that if you put the three children together as one, you have that whole range from, as you suggest, saintly to thoughtless to almost evil.
Well, selfish, yeah, certainly acting entirely on self-interest. Yeah, I'd never thought about it that way, but that's quite an interesting point. Yeah, they almost amount to a whole human personality, or at least to the range of possible human personalities. I mean, I think the eldest brother, Anton, and Amor, the youngest daughter, shape up as the two twin poles of the book. And in some way, they embody the twin poles of my own South African nature. Whereas Astrid, the middle sister, she's neither good nor bad. She's simply caught up in her own hedonistic and myopic sense of self. I don't think she looks very much further than the boundaries of her own life. She's certainly not engaged, with the future of the nation. And she's not exceptional. I mean, I think most humans go through their lives in that way, don't necessarily deserve to be condemned for it. But, both Anton and Amor, on the other hand, have a certain, what shall we say, a moral inflection, which runs in contrary directions. And I hope by the end of the book, it's perceived that they are the two, whether you call them protagonists or antagonists, I don't know, but they're the two central characters insofar as the book has a central character, because there are a lot of subsidiary characters that occupy a central position for a moment or two as well.
But of course, right from the beginning, Anton feels such guilt because he has murdered a Black woman or shot a Black woman on the very day his mother dies. He carries that guilt with him throughout the rest of his life, which ultimately, well, and maybe he was already there at the beginning, turns into an addiction to alcohol.
Yeah, I'm not so sure he carries the guilt in the sense of being tormented by it. I mean, it's true that it comes back to him. It would, wouldn't it? But the moment that you describe is an almost arbitrary one. He's a conscripted soldier, as all young men were supposed to be at that time. He gets sent to a township to quell a protest, and in an almost random moment, a woman who picks up a rock and is throwing it offends him, and he takes his rifle and shoots her. That moment bugs him very much at the beginning of the book. But then when the memory of the woman comes back much later, the book tells us that he hasn't thought about her in a very long time. But then when he does think about her, the emotion, of course, is very intense. So in that sense, it's not forgotten, as all our deeds are, destined to be unforgotten. They're all buried in us somewhere and still retain their original charge, I think. But it is possible to go through life not thinking about the terrible things one has done, except at certain arbitrary moments, and then, one puts them away again. I'm amazed at the human capacity to absorb our own atrocious behavior. Probably a human necessity, because if we did carry a full consciousness with us of what we are doing on the earth, I don't think it would be possible to proceed for very long.
Indeed, indeed. I want to go back to the title of the book, The Promise, because surely you're referring as much to the promise made to South Africa itself in those early days after Nelson Mandela was freed, and the country seemed to attempt to move into a direction of equity and fairness. And Bishop Tutu had the confessions and guilt and forgiveness. What happened to that promise is really in the background of your book.
Yeah, very much. I mean, there are several broken promises in the book, not just, you know, the one that gives the book its title, but that's very much a dominant one. Yeah, it's very hard to convey how overwhelming, you know, those heady days were back in the 90s when we thought, you know, we had the chance to remake the country and remake the future. When I was growing up, there was not the slightest possibility on the horizon that Nelson Mandela would ever come out of jail, that the ANC would be unbanned, that we would have a, you know, a black majority government in this country. It just was not possible. But when it did come, it came quite rapidly. It felt as if it was overnight. Of course, you know, there'd been a long build-up, historically speaking, to that moment, but it arrived in a rush. And similarly, you know, the world seemed to open up. But along with it, it has to be said, you know, we'd had several decades in South Africa of living in a very artificial test tube, really. Under sanctions, there were not a lot of ideas flowing in from outside. Television only came to South Africa at the end of the 70s. There were, you know, the government was very afraid of, you know, the information it might provide. You know, lots of books were banned. A lot of, you know, thinkers were not available to us. So we didn't have much sense of how politics works in the real world. There was a sense that time was frozen and that nothing was ever going to change. So with this very rapid transformation that we went through, I suppose we had a naive belief that we could do things that clearly we haven't been able to carry out. But I don't think there are many South Africans who feel the promise that was held out to us back in those days has been remotely fulfilled. I mean, the sense of despondency and disappointment is almost palpable right now.
Where are you living now?
I'm in Cape Town, way down south. I've been here since, you know, I came to study here, always intending to leave, but never quite managing. And I think I should probably accept I'm not going to be moving at this point.
And how do you find your life there now?
Well, listen, I have an extremely privileged existence. I always have had relative to, you know, people at the bottom of the heap in South Africa. You know, I've had tough times as a writer where I have not had a lot of money, but even those times were really nothing compared to what the majority of people are having to deal with on a daily basis here. So I have nothing to complain of. My anxieties about the country and about the future are not really centered on my own life, which is quite full. They're centered on the national life and the anxiety that what the state needs to do to turn this mess around is simply not within its capabilities any longer.
Here is a question from one in our audience, from Libby, who says, you portray the difficulties and illnesses of the human condition so well. bulimia, alcoholism, OCD, depression, etc. You have personal experience yourself, a close friend, a relative who's battled those demons?
Sure. It's nice of you to assume they're not my demons, that they belong to a friend. Some of them are mine, not all. But yeah, I mean, without going into specific details, I've had, of course, I've had friends who've suffered with all sorts of afflictions, mental and physical, and I've suffered some of them myself. I mean, is there anybody on earth who hasn't had some experience of physical or mental affliction? I'd be surprised to hear it.
How do you think any of those or all of those mentioned could have affected the way you not only look at the world, but write about it?
Well, sure. You know, I mean, I do a little bit of work with students now and then, and you know, I always tell them, although it seems to me, you know, completely obvious, that the raw material of fiction is conflict, essentially. People's attention is held by conflict, disagreement. One's brain very quickly slides off harmony. For whatever reason, it's kind of numbing, beautiful though it may be. But where there's a sense of rupture or displacement, something that needs to be sorted out, healed, resolved, there's a certain tension created. If you hear about it, if you're an audience member, how will this work itself out? I suppose it's a displaced anxiety about one's own life. Sense that if this problem had to affect me, how would it work itself out? How would I work it out? But that's the way you hold people's attention. And I've certainly had a life that's had its full of conflict, from, you know, an unhappy home life in childhood, a bout of serious illness as a child. Well, I don't want to give you a litany of my life woes, especially as my life is fairly comfortable at the moment. But like everyone else, I've been exposed to all kinds of conflicts, and like most South Africans, maybe to, you know, very intense forms of political conflict, which cause great unease. You're experiencing some of that yourselves in America at the moment, where
Indeed.
The future becomes so very, very uncertain. One's anxiety levels rise, and consequently one's engagement with the entire society is, you know, raised.
What kinds of serious illness did you experience as a child?
I had lymphoma as a small boy. At the age of 6, I was very, very ill with a form of lymphoma that's actually easily treatable if it's caught in the early stages, but mine was not. And as a result, I came very, very close to dying. My parents were told they should prepare themselves and that there was no way I would recover, but I'm here, so apparently I did. But it did involve 5 years of chemotherapy and a great deal of time spent in hospitals and sick rooms, which is where, incidentally, I think my love of books and reading developed, because I was being read to all the time. And it was obviously a time in which I felt very vulnerable, and books provided me with great comfort, and they still do. Even depressing books comfort me because they're not my life, you know.
Your inner life had time to grow while you were experiencing that illness.
I guess, yeah. I guess so. I mean, you know, and from receiving the sort of consolation of that richer inner life from books, it was just a short step to wanting to make those artifacts myself.
Interesting.
Yeah, I was determined from a young age.
Couple of questions. One about the style of writing. I like the style of combining prose and dialogue into the same paragraph. Is that a writing technique you first used in The Promise, or did you develop it in your earlier novels?
I used it in a slightly different way in an earlier book, In a Strange Room. I mean, essentially, I think what this questioner is referring to is the fact that I've stripped the text of most of the usual punctuation marks that
Right,
separate one thing from another.
right.
So that the experience of reading the book hopefully is an experience of taking in the language of it. And I ran together the dialogue, the narrative description, sometimes the inner thoughts of characters, without those markers that would sort of usefully demarcate which was which.
You wanted us to work for it.
Well, that's part of it. I do think the reader needs to do their share of work, but quite aside from that, I like the fact that you cannot always distinguish between what may be a character's interior reflection or a line of dialogue, simply because there very often isn't that distinction in one's own mind. I mean, you have a thought and you may actually utter it aloud or not. But yeah, I've kind of lost my thread, I'm afraid. Sorry, but yeah, I wanted the experience to be linguistic. So on the level of language, you take it in, and as you say, yeah, I think the reader needs to do a little bit of work. But
And in the middle of the paragraph, every now and then, an invisible narrator jumps in and says a few words, and then we're left to wonder, well, who's saying that? Who's the narrator here?
Right. The narrator was a sort of relatively late arrival in the book. I'd already, every book has its narrator, but the conventional approach is that you try to make that narrator as unobtrusive as possible. I mean, to the point of invisibility. In fact, you don't want to feel that the story is being told to you. You want to feel you're witnessing it. But I had the experience of breaking away from the book at a certain point to do a couple of drafts of a film script. And when I came back to the novel, the logic of the film transferred itself to the prose. And I suddenly saw that it offered a lot of possibility in terms of multiple perspectives, of being able to offset the point of view of one particular character immediately against the point of view of another. Sometimes to offset a particular scene against another. So this involved a lot of very, very rapid cutting, as it were. I mean, to use the cinematic term, from one perspective to another perspective. But if you're going to do that, you lose the invisibility of the narrator. You make the narrator very evident.
Yes.
And that presented me with a problem. How do I do the expected thing and conceal the fact that this very rapid mobile narration is being spoken to us? And then I thought, don't disguise it, emphasize it, heighten the fact that this story is being told to you, because all stories are told by somebody. And it seemed a useful outcome if people wondered, as you did, who is telling the story.
Yeah.
So I deliberately played a game with that question too, because it could be a woman, it could be a man, and there are even moments where it might not be a human. There's certain moments where the narrator talks about you humans as if the narrator, is something else. And then, of course, the narrative sometimes comes so close to a particular character that it falls into their head and lapses into the first person.
Yeah.
So this was a way of, fracturing the narrative yet further and splaying the narrative voices, as it were, into first, second, and third.
And one of our listeners says the narrator had such a strong personality that I expected to be introduced to him or her as a previously unrevealed character of the story. You really got him.
Well, good. I mean, I'm very gratified by that response because I think that is the function of a narrator. And coming back to the Fellini epigraph, quite a sharp observer said to me that she felt you could only really understand a Fellini movie if you regard the camera as one of the characters. But the camera has a personality of its own. So on some subliminal level, all these elements seem to cohere. So yeah, I think of the narrator as a character, or at least as a presence in the book, but one that doesn't take a part in the action, that is simply relaying it to us.
You mentioned working on a movie script. Is it for the book, The Promise?
No. It was an entirely different project, long out of my hands by now. I did a couple of drafts and then decided my book was the more important project and returned to it. I don't think there's very much of my script left in the final movie version, but that's neither here nor there. I was grateful for the chance to work on the movie, but also I feel it was a gift, the narrative voice that I got from that experience.
Do you think that The Promise could become a movie in it of itself?
Well, there's been a fair amount of interest, and I'm talking to some people at the moment, so it does seem possible. It does seem possible.
A number of people have asked, why do we never, until the very end, get the perspective of the Black characters?
Well, in fact, we don't, even at the end. I should point that out. There isn't really a moment where, the interior world of the Black characters opens to us. That was a choice I made. It seems to have been the most contentious choice I've made. A number of commentators in the UK have raised that point, and it's bothered them, which again doesn't displease me, for the simple reason that, how to put this, a character like Salome, to whom the house has been promised, the house and the piece of land, she's a fairly uneducated, rural Black woman who's been working for this family for most of her life.
Yes.
There are millions of such women and men, I guess, out there in South Africa right now. We're nearly 30 years into democracy, and people like Salome, that's incidentally a South African pronunciation of her name, people like her still have no presence or voice here at all. So it felt innately wrong to me to go into her interior world in the same way that I was doing with the white characters, and thereby imply that her presence and agency in the general story of South Africa is on an equal footing with theirs. It's not. I didn't stay out of the inner lives of Black characters because I was indifferent to them. Quite the opposite. I wanted the silence to be eloquent, and I wanted their present absence, their absent presence, however you want to formulate it, to be a problem for the reader. I wanted it to be bothersome. So it's pleasing to me that it has been, at least for some readers. I did toy with the idea of doing exactly what this questioner seems to think I did do, and at the end sort of, cross the threshold and let Salome's inner life reveal itself. But I decided against that in favor of letting this impish, omniscient narrator do one of a few disturbing little pirouettes in the middle of the narrative and turn on the reader and point a finger, as it were, out of the page and say, if you didn't know anything about this woman, if you didn't know this detail about her life, maybe it's because you weren't interested. Maybe it's because you didn't care to ask. And I hope that's a disturbing moment for readers in which they feel implicated. You know, it's not fair to implicate everybody in that. Not everybody is responsible, but I do think it's fair that we should carry Salome's problem around with us after the book is closed and not feel it's been resolved, because it hasn't.
But there is that conversation between Salome's son and Amor at the end of the book when he says, why didn't you do this sooner? You know, you're freeing your guilty conscience. He's not overwhelmed with gratitude for his mother, to put it mildly.
Well, should he be? I mean, his mother has finally, after 30 years, been given a broken down house on a useless piece of land, which this white family has gone through incredible convolutions not to give her. So, you know, it's taken several decades for them to follow through on their promise. And when they do, you know, what does the promise offer actually? So I don't think he's wrong. He, in a certain sense, I think is the voice of the future. He represents a very angry generation that's very much on the rise in South Africa, that, you know, is calling the past to account and saying, why, when apartheid is supposedly gone, do we live in a society that still very much resembles the apartheid one? He's very angry about it, and I don't think he's wrong to be.
Well, and on that note, I fear we must leave you. This has been such a special conversation, and I so appreciate your being here. Damon Galgut, congratulations on The Promise. I look forward to reading your past books and your next one.
Diane, thank you so much. I've really, really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And our next meeting will be on Wednesday, February 23rd, in honor of Black History Month. I'll host a panel discussion of the 1619 Project, a new origin story, featuring contributors to the book. Our book club is produced by Allison Brody. Adrian Danhauser has been our engineer today. Yanlin Zhang is our events manager. We couldn't do this without the support of Virendra Silva, Julia Slattery, April Stevens, Lynn Kronberger, Brian Colombo, and Michelle Morgan. A very special thanks to all of those people and to all of you for being part of this program. I do hope you will stay on for a few moments to respond to a brief survey that you'll see up on the screen. Thank you again, and I'll see you next month. Bye-bye.